For my homework, I am going to be interviewing my granddad, who remembers the Canvey Island flood thing. So, do you know when the flood happened?
Yeah, it was in 1953. It was part of the spring tide.
Okay. What was your reaction when you heard of the flood?
Well, it was quite worrying because at the time we had relatives living there, and communication in them days wasn't quite as good as they are today. And all he was hearing what was basically being said on the news. What happened to your friends and relatives on the island?
Well,
they was awoken at 3 o'clock in the morning because the tide came over at Leebeck, part of Canvey Island, and it surged all the way through. Normally, the dikes that were there would take the extra water that came over, but this particular spring tide was the worst they'd had for many years, and they couldn't handle it, so it came over, and within a very short space of time, most of the island was underwater. The only part that wasn't underwater was the part called the Village, which has got a public house sitting on it. It used to be called the Red Cow, but they renamed it the King Canoe, because that was the only part of the island that didn't get covered in water.
Do you know how long the flood lasted?
Yeah, it lasted. It lasted for a week or two because they had to wait till the tide subsided before they could disperse the water. But it was actually. It involved the whole of the east coast of England because there was lots of places that were known to water, and that because Canvey Island is one of the lowest points on the east coast, and that actually got it the worst.
After the flood, did they rebuild anything different?
Yeah, there wasn't so many houses, or there was no houses on there in them days, but the bungalows were only in certain areas. Most of it was just farmland, but what they've done is that once the flood subsided, the water authorities started to rebuild the sea wall, which in them days was only like a mud mound. They started to rebuild it out of steel girders.
So, did the floods? You know, you said it affected a few areas. What areas were these? You know, did it affect
it affected the whole of the island, which was inhabited. I believe there was over 100 people that lost their lives there. In some parts, it was 30, 40 feet deep. The sea and sea front, where the main sea area is. It devastated all the lives of the people, and there was people literally sitting on the roofs waiting to be rescued. The army got in there early hours in the morning to start farming people off, and they wanted to get them off before the next high tide came in, which was going to be so many hours later in the next day, so they had to get the people off. Most of the people got evacuated within 12 hours. Unfortunately, some people lost their lives.
What was in the news and in the newspapers?
Well, it was being talked about in the news as the whole of the East Coast was suffering for it. It was the fact that the spring tides melted very quickly up in the north, and the sudden tide surge came down through the North Sea, and parts of Holland suffered as well as part of England. It doesn't happen very often, but there was a threat of it happening again a couple of years ago, but it never didn't materialise so badly.
Is there anything else you know about the flood that I didn't including my questions? Or
Yeah, once they rebuilt the wall, they started to put pumping stations in so that it didn't happen again. But they eventually just piped up most of the dikes that were there, that were built by the Dutch. The Dutch owned the island, and they returned it to England back in the 16th century, I think it was. And they were good at building dikes and preserving land, because when this flood was over, they piped and tubed up most of the dikes underneath. They're still there, but they're underneath the ground now. But a few years ago, they rebuilt the wall, and it's a bigger one now, purely because they put the Thames barrier in, and when that goes up, it pushes the tide back down again, and we get a lot more high tides in that area than what we did, say, before that was built. But they also rebuilt all the pumping stations, so they're much more efficient now. So the chances of it happening again are quite remote, really.
Well, thank you for your time, and thank you very much.
Okay.